In today's video, we're going to give you 5 things that every Christian young man should have figured out by the time he graduates college, and hopefully even sooner. Don't go away. All right, guys, your friend Spencer here. This is the Christian Manhood channel. This is kind of a side note channel that we do normally from our regular YouTube channel. So go ahead and subscribe to this one. We appreciate you guys very much. And hit the like button for the YouTube algorithm. We appreciate you guys being here today with us. So there's a war on young men today. No question at all. There is a dreadful war trying to emasculate men and trying to, I think, prevent men from growing up to be these giants that God wants them to be. We need leaders today, but we don't have any because just the dumbing down of society. I would even say the wimping down of society. Some would even call it the simping down of society. Whatever term you want to use is fine, but definitely understand there's a war against men, and young men especially have got to overcome some very tough hurdles today to just operate as God intended them to operate. And we want to try to give you 5 things that every Christian young man should have nailed down in his character and his life, hopefully as soon as possible, but by the time they graduate from college. And that is a minimum. I mean, that's like the deadline, the latest I would ever say that this should be figured out for sure. So I hope you write these 5 things down, and hopefully they'll be a blessing and enrich your life, and that'll be a great help to us. So 5 things every Christian young man should have nailed down in his life before he graduates college. Number 1, he ought to have some theological convictions about him. He ought to understand who God is and what the Bible is, and what basic doctrine is. You'd be surprised today how many young men are graduating from these Christian liberal arts colleges, and they don't even understand, what the difference between a Jehovah's Witness and a Baptist is. And that's shameful. It really should not be that way. I want to tell you this. People who do not have their theological convictions nailed down end up becoming prey to the cults. They say that the Mormon denomination, it's really not a denomination, it's a cult really. The Mormon cult is made up by a bunch of former Southern Baptist church members. And I can believe that, because the average person today in the average pew, especially evangelical, fundamental, whatever, they don't even know what they believe. They don't understand what salvation by grace through faith is. They have no clue what any of that stuff is. And unfortunately, a lot of young men are being swept away into these false churches. So you ought to have some theological convictions about you. You ought to know, this is the Bible that I'm going to use. This is the Bible version I'm going to use. This is the type of church that I belong to. And know why you do those things, and have all of that nailed down. Do you know why Jesus Christ is God? Do you know why we preach salvation by grace through faith? Do you have any clue why we do any of this stuff? Well, you ought to have that nailed down. Number 2, I think every Christian young man, by the time he graduates college, hopefully sooner, is able to have his moral and ethical convictions nailed down. You ought to have some moral and ethical convictions about yourself. I want to tell you right now that if you were to walk into a building and it was filled with men from the age of 20 to 30, and there was 10,000 men in that room, I guarantee you 9,900 of them are addicted to pornography. It is an epidemic. It is destroying young men. And really, someone says that pornography is free because you pay with your soul. And you do. It ruins your mind. It ruins your soul. You get to where you don't even see, you're not even looking for a wife anymore. And many young men who are addicted to pornography, they literally cannot even understand a family. They don't even see a wife. They see an object of pleasure, and it shouldn't be that way. It warps your mind. And so you need to have some ethical convictions and moral convictions about you that are born really out of your theological convictions, and say, I'm not looking at stuff like that. And quite frankly, you need to have some musical convictions too, because I think music is the gateway to much of this stuff. A lot of people get caught up in rap music, and they get caught up in all all kinds of degenerate, filthy stuff. I mean, Beyonce just came out with a song the other day called Church Girl, and it was the most degenerate, guttural, vile lyrics I think I've heard in a long time. Not all time, of course, but in a long time. And I think that that is a just a tragedy that that kind of stuff is being promoted today. And young people are just eating it up. They're just eating it up and just going crazy over it. They love that stuff. And you ought to have some convictions morally and ethically about yourself. You ought to decide, I'm going to tell the truth to people. I'm not going to lie to people. I'm not going to try to cut corners. I'm going to do the best I can. And I'm going to, as far as work goes, and I'm not going to lie to people. I'm going to tell people the truth. I'm going to be a man who can get out of bed in the morning. I'm going to be a man who can be on time to work. I'm going to be a man who, if I can't get it done, I'll tell you and I'll tell you why. And I'll just be straight with people. Don't be a lying guy. And, but also, have some moral convictions. When we watch movies, if we do watch any entertainment, we don't watch a whole lot, but if we do, if they get out of control with the cussing and whatever like that, we don't watch stuff like that. And I think every Christian young man needs to have some boundaries drawn morally in their life so that they can just decide beforehand, we're not watching that trash in our home. We're not doing that. And have some guts about you, some Christian character, and that's what you need. Number 3 thing that every Christian young man needs to have by the time he graduates college is monetizable skills. Now, what I mean by that is you should know a trade. You should know something that is able to provide money for you. Like you should be able to know how to weld. You should be able to know IT. You should be able to do something that makes money and provides for a family, because ultimately that's what God's called you to do. God's called you, unless you have some special calling from the Lord to not be a family man, God's called you to lead a family. And you can't do that if you don't know anything. You can't do that if you don't have any skills. You can't do that if you don't know how to do anything anywhere. I mean, you'd be surprised how many young men today, 23 years old, don't even know how to change a tire, and some of them don't even know how to change a light bulb. I mean, what have you done with your life? Where have you been? And I want to tell you guys, this may break some of your heart, but you graduate high school and all you know how to do is eat potato chips and play video games. That's not a monetizable skill, and you daddies out there need to turn all that stuff off and teach your boys how to do stuff. And when I was a young man, I hate that. But when I went to college, I didn't know how to do anything, and I had to play catch up, and it was grueling. But I got to where I was able to do a few things. And boy, I'm gonna tell you right now, a young man who's out there in the world who has no value to a business and no value to the workforce is a miserable young man. And so you need to learn monetizable skills. I got a camera sitting right here on this counter, and you know what I'm going to do later today? I'm going to put that in the hand of my kids and say, y'all go take pictures. I want you to learn how to take pictures, because that's just I want them to know things, and you should know things too. And monetizable skills. You ought to have a degree in something. You ought to learn something. And you ought to be able to take care of your family. Number 4 thing every Christian young man ought to have, at least by the time he graduates college, you ought to have figured out what God's will for your life is. Now, I know some people may disagree with that, but I want to tell you the truth. There are so many young men out there sitting around and they're 40 years old and they're like, I don't know what God wants me to do. Well, God's not playing a hide and seek game with you. He's not. If you seek the will of God, He will show you the will of God. If you obey the will of God that you have so far, then God will reveal more and more and more to you. I knew, really, when I was 20 years old, I knew that God wanted me in missions. I knew it. And I didn't have all the specifics of it ironed out, but I knew God wanted me to be in missions, and I've been involved in missions. I'm almost 40 now. I've been involved in missions almost the entirety of my ministry. And so you ought to have the will of God figured out for your life for the most part. And the sad thing is, and I said this to somebody not long ago, I said, you're aiming at nothing and you're hitting it. And that's the saddest testimony about a young man's life. He aimed at nothing and he hit it. And so what you need to do, and here's what I would suggest to you, okay? Sit down. If you don't know what the will of God is, sit down with a notepad, turn off TVs, phones, turn off everything, and write down what you know the will of God is not. Write down what you know the will of God is not. For example, you know that the will of God is not for you to be a pro wrestler. Okay, write that down. That may sound stupid, but write it down. I know the will of God is not for me to, join the military. If that's not the will of God for you, write it down. I know it's the will of God for me not to leave my family and join the circus. Okay, write that down, and you'll get a list of things that are not the will of God, and that can help you see maybe the possibilities of this could be the will of God, and then pray about those things and see how the Lord leads in all that, and then get godly counsel around your life. Of course, you need a pastor and things like that as well, but find out what the will of God is for the most part. Start seeking that now and asking God, Lord, what do you want me to do in my life? And He will show you. And the reason I think why the Lord doesn't show a lot of young men is because they don't want to know. Do you want to know the will of God? Do you want to know God's will for your life? Well, if you do, He'll tell you. And that's a fact, friend. So know and be doing the will of God. And then also number 5, here's the thing you ought to have, and maybe there's a little bit of overlap in some of these. But number 5, I think every Christian young man ought to have the conviction, as soon as possible, that I'm going to be in church all of my life. I'm going to be in church all of my life. I don't care what's happening. I don't care if it's the Super Bowl. I don't care if anything. I mean, I'm not going to allow a job at Taco Bell to pull me out of church. Now, there's only a couple people that I'm gracious to when it comes to being out of church on Sunday and working on Sundays. And that's firemen, policemen, and people in the medical field, and people who have, missions of mercy. Like if you work for the power company and a major snowstorm comes in on Saturday night and like 100,000 people have no power, and they call you in to go repair the power lines so that people can get back up and running, and you miss Sunday morning church because of that, I'm okay with that. I would call that, an emergency. Your ox is in the ditch, so to say. That's the biblical term that Jesus used. But you get a job at 18 working at Taco Bell, and some manager tells you got to come in on Sunday and miss church. That's not the will of God for your life. You just tell them, say, I go to church. Too bad. I won't be here. You can put me on the schedule if you want to. I will not be here. I will be in church. And you have to get tough with these people. But you need to have that boundary. You need to have that conviction. The house of God is where I will be. And have that conviction as a young man. I'm glad I made that choice. When I was 18, I said, Lord, I spent 18 years of my life out of church. And I said, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. God, if you'll help me, I'll spend the rest of my days in church. And God has been good. He's enabled me to do that. And I've had to butt heads with a few people over the years. I've had, quite frankly, I've had to butt heads with my own family over that sometimes. Not my wife and kids. I'm talking about my other family. I've even had to butt heads with my parents over that. I'm going to church. That's it. And so I hope you get these things down. 5 things every Christian young man ought to have figured out at least by the time he graduates college. He ought to have some theological convictions about him. He ought to have some moral and ethical convictions saying, we're not going there. We're not partaking in that debauchery. He ought to have some monetizable skills, and he ought to know and be at least be seeking and have some idea of the will of God and be pursuing that. Because, look, careers are cool, but knowing and doing the will of God, that is where the real satisfaction in life is at. Find the will of God and do the will of God. You ought to be able to do that. And then number 5, I would say you need to have the conviction that you need to stay in church. 5 things every Christian young man ought to have. God bless you, friend. We love you. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. We'll talk to you soon.